What happens when a kitchen shelf becomes a lifeline? Picture a storm rolling toward a village, roads sinking under floodwater, markets shutting their doors. A single cabinet opens and jars glow in the dim light. Inside are flavors that carried families through hard seasons. Sichuan heat resting in oil. Coastal fish simmered with salted black beans. Mountain vegetables sealed so deeply in brine, their taste grows stronger with time. Across China, generations watched rivers rise and winters bite, so they filled their pantries with food that stayed steady when everything else changed. So what exactly sits inside those shelves, ready to outlast chaos and comfort a family when nothing fresh can be found? These are the 20 canned foods the Chinese stockpile that never expire. What disaster would push a family to turn a single mustard stem into a lifesaver? In the late 1800s, during the final decades of the Qing dynasty, farmers in Fuling watched their crops wilt under unpredictable rains and sudden cold snaps. One grower, records mention a man surnamed Jiang, discovered that the knobby mustard tubers could survive nearly anything if treated with enough salt, pressure, and time. What began as a small experiment soon spread through Sichuan's river towns. The secret behind Shakai is its transformation. First, the tuber is salted until it weeps, then pressed, then buried in clay crocks for months. Fermentation reshapes the flavor, tightening it into something sharp, smoky, and durable. Even without refrigeration, the vegetable sits safely in its brine, waiting for the moment someone needs it most. For families across Sichuan, Shakai became more than a condiment. It was the jar opened during lean winters. The flavor added to congee when nothing else remained, the taste that reminded soldiers and migrants of home. But if a single vegetable can wait out storms, what happens when preservation turns to fish sealed in oil, capable of lasting for years? What kind of meal survives travel, war, and time? In 1894, in the bustling streets of Guangzhou, a small workshop began frying local dace fish in bubbling oil and packing them tightly with fermented black beans. The technique wasn't new. Fishermen along the Pearl River had preserved fish this way for generations. But canning it changed everything. By the early 1900s, companies like Pearl River Bridge were exporting these tins across Southeast Asia. The secret lies in the pairing. The dace is fried until every drop of moisture disappears, then sealed with the salty, earthy punch of fermented beans. Oil locks out air. The beans keep bacteria at bay. The result is a can that can sit through monsoon seasons, long voyages, and wartime shortages without losing strength. For Cantonese families, this wasn't emergency food. It was comfort. A taste of home opened in foreign cities. A quick meal when money was tight. A memory passed from parent to child. But if this little fish could anchor southern kitchens through hard years, what happens when we open a can filled not with seafood, but with vegetables pressed into deep, dark oil? What if a single spoonful of greens could taste like the memory of an entire coastline? Imagine a Cantonese pantry in the early 1900s where jars of dark, glossy leaves waited on wooden shelves. This was Ganlin, a mix of mustard greens and Chinese olives slowly simmered in oil until they turned almost black, carrying a fragrance that once guided sailors home. The origins trace back to Shantou and Shaozhou during the late Qing era, when families needed food that could survive humid summers and unpredictable trade routes. Merchants traveling between Guangdong and Southeast Asia relied on it as a dependable companion, something that stayed stable through storms and cargo delays. The secret lies in the olive oil slow reduction that removes moisture and locks flavor deep into every shred. Without water, spoilage has nothing to cling to, and the greens grow richer as months pass. Open a modern can, and you can still smell that coastal history. People mix it into rice, noodles, or porridge when life gets busy and comfort needs to be fast. But if Ganlin Kai turns simple grains into a feast, what happens when the next food transforms something humble into a warm, nutty reward the moment you open the lid? What makes a peanut survive the kind of winters that shut down villages? In the 1930s, as northern China faced harsh cold and rationing, families discovered that simmering peanuts in soy sauce and spices created something that could be bottled, sealed, and stored for months. This became Shuizhu Huasheng, a quiet hero of tight times and long journeys. Its roots stretch even earlier to Ming Dynasty cooks who slow-braised nuts for imperial banquets. When wartime shortages struck centuries later, the method shifted from luxury to necessity. The survival secret is simple. Peanuts are boiled until the shells drink in salt, star anise, and cinnamon. Once canned, the absence of air and the natural oils create a barrier that resists spoilage. Instead of turning stale, the flavor deepens as the weeks go by. Today, people reach for these cans during road trips, late-night study sessions, or sudden power outages. They offer warmth without fire, comfort without preparation, and a taste so familiar it feels like sitting in an old kitchen again. And if peanuts can hold their strength through time, wait until you meet the next jar, where tofu transforms into something bold, pungent, and almost mythic. A traveler once wrote in his diary in 1736 that a single cube of furu could wake a tired bowl of rice from its sleep. He wasn't exaggerating. Open an old pantry in Jiangsu or Anhui, and you might find a clay jar sealed with wax, holding blocks of tofu the color of sunrise, sharp aroma, silky texture, a flavor that has quietly survived famine years, long winters, and forgotten dynasties. The roots of furu go back to the late Ming period when tofu makers learned that allowing tofu to age under rice wine, salt, and chili didn't spoil it. It transformed it. Farmers discovered that this aged tofu kept for months even in humid southern climates where fresh food wilted fast. By the early Qing era, families in Huizhou were making their own batches every autumn, tucking them away for the cold season ahead. Its endurance isn't magic. Salt stops decay. Rice wine guards the tofu from bacteria. Clay jars breathe just enough to keep moisture from building. Inside, time works slowly, turning each cube soft and creamy, almost like a spread that warms the throat on a freezing morning. Today, travelers buy furu in small glass bottles, the way others buy souvenirs. Families pair it with congee or stir it into hot dishes for a depth that no modern seasoning can copy. The flavor speaks of preservation as skill, patience, and quiet confidence. But once a pantry holds something rich and soft, what happens when survival depends on meat that stays firm, spiced, and ready for the harshest months? The next jar carries that story forward. A story can begin with a scent. Imagine a pot simmering in a small courtyard kitchen of late Qing Guangzhou around the 1880s. 5 spice drifting into winter air, star anise warming the nose, soy darkening the broth to the color of old lacquer. That aroma, rich, steady, unmistakable, would one day become the soul of canned wuxiang ruding or spiced pork cubes. Merchants along the Pearl River first pushed for longer-lasting meat during years when sea routes stalled and fresh pork spoiled before reaching inland towns. Cooks answered with a method that blended braising and reduction. Pork belly was cut into tight cubes, simmered until the fat turned silky, then sealed in oil and spice. Once cooled, the mixture held its flavor for months. That stability made it a quiet companion during the 1911 Xinhai Revolution, when families sometimes lived off preserved foods while cities shifted overnight. Its survival secret sites in the balance of salt, soy, and melted fat. Every cube becomes its own container, oil wrapping the meat like a protective coat. Oxygen stays out, flavor stays in. Time moves slowly around it. Today you'll still find these cubes tucked into rice bowls across southern China. Mothers spoon them over congee for children rushing to school. Travelers buy them as gifts because the taste survives long trips. But after savoring meat this deep and fragrant, the palate starts to crave something crisp and earthy, a texture born from forests and rain. That path leads us to the next can. Listen before you look. The first hint arrives as a soft crackle. That's the sound bamboo shoots make when they hit hot oil, a sound recorded in Jiang kitchens as far back as the Southern Song era in the 1100s. Farmers near Hangzhou gathered tender spring shoots, peeled them at dusk, and cooked them down with soy and sugar until each piece gleamed like polished wood. Only later, in the early 20th century, did canning turn this fleeting seasonal ingredient into something that could outlast the year. The secret lies in transformation. Fresh bamboo spoils quickly, but once braised, its moisture reduces, its fibers tighten, and its natural sugars deepen. The oil creates a seal. The soy darkens into a protective glaze. Inside a sealed tin, these shoots hold their flavor through winter scarcity and long journeys. During the 1937 evacuations in eastern China, families carried cans of human sun because the shoots stayed firm and nourishing when vegetables were impossible to find. Modern cooks cherish them for their snap. The bite starts gentle, then releases a mellow sweetness shaped by fire and time. They slide into stir-fries, sit over rice, or join New Year banquets as a symbol of growth and renewal. But once you taste bamboo shaped by flame and patience, curiosity stirs. What happens when preservation isn't about heat or oil, but about the bright sting of vinegar and the warmth it chases away? The next jar holds that answer. A traveler in the late Ming era once wrote about tasting a slice of ginger so sharp and bright that it cleared the fog from the mind. He wasn't exaggerating. Pickled ginger, or Jiang, earned its place in Chinese households because it did more than flavor a meal. It guarded families through seasons when fresh vegetables vanished from the markets and winter crept into every room. Its origins trace back to coastal Fujian during the 1500s, where sailors needed food that survived months at sea. Ginger, already valued in Chinese medicine for warming the body and steadying digestion, proved perfect. By slicing it thin, submerging it in rice vinegar, and sealing it in jars, families created something that resisted spoilage and stayed crisp long after harvest. The secret lies in the ginger's natural heat meeting the vinegar's sharp preservation. Vinegar blocks bacteria. Ginger holds its fire for months. Together, they create a flavor that stays alive even when everything outside feels frozen. Today, Jiang lives on in Lunar New Year dishes, travel snacks, and quiet kitchen corners waiting for cold evenings. And from this bright, bracing bite, we move towards something far darker and deeper in flavor, the enduring strength of fermented black beans. Before you see them, you smell them. An earthy, smoky aroma that once drifted through mountain villages in Warring States-era China. These are dushi, fermented black beans, a preservation technique perfected more than 2,000 years ago by communities in what is now Guizhou and Guangxi. They needed food that stayed steady through brutal winters and sudden shortages, and soybeans offered exactly that. The process looks simple. Boil the beans, let them ferment under straw mats, then salt them until they darken and wrinkle. But each step carries centuries of refinement. Fermentation fills the beans with deep umami. Salt locks out decay. Time draws out a complexity that fresh ingredients can never match. Households treasure dushi because a single spoonful could transform anything, rice, vegetables, dried fish, into something rich and sustaining. In the Qing dynasty, merchants carried jars of it along trade routes because it made even the blandest food travel-ready. Today, chefs still reach for it when they want a flavor that hits with force, a taste that belongs to old mountains and older kitchens. And now that we've stepped into this shadowy world of fermentation, the next jar opens with a completely different kind of preserved patience, one built from the quiet crunch of dried radish strips. A single crunch can tell the story of a village winter. Picture a farmer in Zhejiang in the late 1600s, laying pale slices of radish across bamboo racks as the sun slips toward the horizon. The fields are quiet. The cold is on its way. Every slice he dries becomes insurance against the season when nothing grows. These dried radish strips, known as luobogan, were survival in its simplest form. The process was humble but clever. Sunlight drew out the moisture, salt locked in the flavor. The radish transformed from something fleeting into something that could wait months, sometimes years, without losing its bite. Families kept jars tucked deep in cabinets, knowing they could turn a scoop of these strips into soup, porridge toppings, or braised dishes when fresh produce vanished under frost. Even now, they endure as a taste of home. Street vendors stir-fry them for breakfast noodles. Grandparents add them to congee for a flavor that wakes the senses. Young cooks rediscover them for their earthy sweetness and long-lasting strength. But if dried radish captures the sun, the next preserved treasure carries the memory of an entire port city inside every grain of salt. The story begins with a gust of sea wind drifting through Tianjin's old port in the early 1800s. Traders stepped off boats carrying spices, grain, and cloth, but tucked between barrels was something simpler: finely shredded mustard greens drying in the northern sun. Locals discovered that when these greens were salted, pressed, and aged through the cold months, they became dong cai, a vegetable so fragrant it caught the attention of merchants across northern China. Winter scarcity shaped its importance. The mustard greens absorbed salt and slowly fermented, developing a mellow, savory aroma that could revive even the plainest bowl of rice. Sailors took jars onto long voyages because it resisted spoilage. Families kept it through harsh winters because it needed no heat, no tending, only patience. Today, dong cai remains a kitchen secret with surprising power. A teaspoon can deepen broths, brighten stir-fries, or turn a simple steamed fish into something nostalgic. Its flavor carries a soft warmth, the memory of a city that learned to store sunshine inside a humble jar. And just ahead comes another preserved creation, one born from generations of brining and drying, ready to show how far a single vegetable can travel through time. A sharp, wintry scent escapes the jar the moment it's opened, the kind that hints at mountains, storms, and survival. Snow vegetable, or Shakai, earned its name during the Song dynasty, when farmers in Jiang noticed that mustard greens grown after the first frost developed a cleaner, brighter bitterness. By the late 1200s, families around Ningbo were salting and fermenting these leaves as protection against the long, gray winters when fields slept and trade routes froze. The secret to its longevity rests in the salt. Once packed tightly and left to cure, the leaves release their moisture, then ferment slowly in their own brine. This process locks away freshness and intensifies flavor. That transformation allowed entire villages to rely on Shakai when storms cut them off from markets for weeks. Even now, it appears in noodle shops, train station snacks, and home kitchens, because it brings depth to simple meals and still carries the memory of people who preserved out of necessity, not luxury. And as one jar closes, another tradition waits, something richer, warmer, and built for households that needed both protein and comfort. A single, soft clink of the tin lid brings back the taste of Shanghai's alleys in the 1930s. Street vendors then sold tofu huasheng, braised gluten with peanuts, to workers heading home after long shifts in factories or on docks. It was cheap, filling, and once sealed in jars, astonishingly durable. Gluten might seem fragile, but when wheat dough is washed until only the protein remains, then steamed, fried, and braised in soy and sugar, it becomes dense and absorbent. Add slow-cooked peanuts, and you have a dish that resists spoilage longer than fresh meat ever could. Merchants in Jiangsu and Zhejiang relied on it during wartime shortages in the 1940s, when dependable calories mattered more than variety. Today, tofu huasheng isn't just an emergency food, it's a festival dish, a train snack, a nostalgic taste that reminds people of simpler decades when flavor came from time, not convenience. But its sweetness leads to something sharper next, an ingredient cured in fermentation so bold it can transform a pot of food with a single spoonful. A story begins in the Hakka Hills of southern China, where farmers once waited for winter to test their resolve. When the harvest of mustard greens came in the late Qing era, families in Mei Cai knew the fresh leaves wouldn't last long in the humid climate, so they turned to an older craft. They packed the greens in salt, pressed them under stones, and left them to darken under the sun. Over weeks, the leaves shrank, sweetened, and deepened into what locals called Mei Cai, a supply that could outlive droughts and survive blockades during the turbulent years of the 1800s. Its longevity isn't magic. Salt draws out moisture. The sun transforms the leaves. Time locks in flavor. The final product stores for years, ready to revive with a quick soak and slow braise. Today, Mei Cai still finds its place in kitchens from Guangdong to Taiwan, treasured not only for its smoky sweet depth, but for the memory of families who saved every scrap they grew. And from these preserved greens, we move to something brighter, richer, and wrapped in its own shell of survival. Let's begin with a kitchen scene from the Ming Dynasty around the 1400s. A pot of brine cools near the doorway while freshly laid duck eggs, prized along the canals of Jiangsu, wait in a woven basket. Housewives discovered that when these eggs soaked in strong salt for weeks, the whites tightened into crystal clear firmness, and the yolks turned into glowing orange spheres. Not just food, a reliable reserve for months when fresh produce grew scarce. The secret lies in the brine. Salt penetrates the shell slowly, reshaping the proteins and protecting the egg from time. Even before canning, salted eggs traveled along trade routes because they needed no ice, no fire, no rush. By the early 20th century, they were sealed in tins and shipped across provinces, a dependable comfort during long journeys and unpredictable seasons. Today, the yolk's sandy richness still shows up in pastries, congee, and festival dishes. One bite carries the quiet logic of old households who planned ahead, and from the deep orange glow of a preserved yolk, we step next towards something sharper and fermented, waiting on the shelf with a different kind of patience. A single crunch can tell the story of a whole village. Spicy, pickled long beans, Suanjiangdu, carry that kind of memory. Their tale begins in the humid valleys of Guizhou during the late Qing era, when summer storms often drowned crops overnight. Families learned to save what they could by packing long beans into earthen jars with salt, chili, and just enough time to let nature reshape them. Days later, the beans sharpened into something bright and sour, a flavor that woke people up as surely as a firecracker at dawn. The survival magic hides in the brine. Salt draws out moisture. Fermentation locks the beans in an environment where spoilage can't win. Even in a kitchen with no refrigeration and temperatures shifting wildly between seasons, these jars stayed steady. They were often opened during winter feasts, brought out when travelers dropped by, or carried along by migrants moving from southwest China into cities like Chongqing and Kunming in the 1920s. Today, Suanjiangdu appears in diners across the country, stir-fried with minced pork, mixed into noodles, served as a side dish bright enough to cut through the richest broths. One bite brings heat, tang, and a sense of something ancient still alive. And if beans can hold their strength for months, what happens when meat is treated with time instead of fear? Step into a southern Chinese alley in early December and look up. Strings of meat sway from balconies like red lanterns waiting for a festival night. This is the season of Leia and Lechang, the waxed duck and cured sausages perfected during the Ming Dynasty, when cold months arrived hard and fast and households needed protein that wouldn't spoil before the new year. The craft belonged to families. Salt rubbed into duck skin until it glistened, rice wine poured over pork belly to draw out aroma, chili, sugar, and spices pressed into every fold. Then the southern wind did the rest. Cantonese towns like Foshan and Zhongshan became famous for this slow drying, a process that sealed the meat in layers of protection. No rot, no rush, just flavor deepening with every passing day. Stored in clay pots or hung in shadowed rooms, these meats survived journeys across mountains and rivers. Soldiers carried them. Merchants traded them. Migrant workers brought them to Hong Kong in the 1950s, turning them into festival staples that signaled warmth even in cramped city apartments. Pan-fry a slice today, and the fragrance fills a room before it even hits the plate. Sweet, smoky, comforting in a way that feels older than memory. But if drying and wind can transform raw meat into something nearly immortal, what hidden force could turn humble mushrooms into another long-lasting treasure? A single sound can define a memory for countless Chinese families. It was the soft crackle of dried shiitake hitting a clay bowl before soaking. Those mushrooms, once gathered from mist-covered forests in Fujian and Zhejiang during the Ming Dynasty, became an anchor for households facing long winters and unpredictable harvests. Villagers dried them on bamboo racks, letting mountain winds draw out moisture until each cap turned leathery and light. That drying process created a miracle of survival. Shiitake lose water, but keep their oils and umami locked deep inside. Months, even years later, a brief soak brings them back to life. The aroma rises first, woodsy, smoky, almost sweet, filling the room with the scent of forests far away. In crises, those mushrooms meant protein, depth, and comfort when fresh food disappeared. Today, they remain a pantry essential across China, not for nostalgia alone, but for their reliability. And once a pot begins to simmer with revived shiitake, the mind drifts to the next ingredient waiting in the dark of storage. History sometimes floats to shore in the simplest form. Along China's eastern coast during the Qing Dynasty, fishermen dried strands of kelp beneath the sun, knowing the ocean's gift could outlast any season. Salt water did half the preservation. Time and wind finished the rest. When fully dried, kelp transformed into something astonishing, nearly weightless, nearly immortal, ready to return to tenderness the moment it touched hot broth. Its secret lies in its natural salts and minerals. Once dried, kelp resists decay, keeping its nutrients sealed inside tough folds that soften only when needed. Families relied on it during typhoons, trade disruptions, and winter shortages. One strip could thicken soups, stretch meals, or lend iodine to diets that desperately needed it. Modern kitchens still keep it in quiet stacks, not out of habit, but wisdom. It waits patiently, unchanged, until its deep ocean flavor is called forward again. And after kelp's calm reliability, something far more decadent steps up. Sometimes survival wears a luxurious disguise. XO sauce began not in hardship but in 1980s Hong Kong, where chefs blended dried scallops, dried shrimp, and chilies into a paste so rich it was nicknamed after top-shelf cognac. But its roots stretch back centuries, to coastal towns that sun-dried seafood to survive winters. Those traditions shape the very ingredients that make XO last: low moisture, intense salting, and oils that preserve flavor like a seal. Inside a jar, the mixture barely changes over time. Dried scallops crumble into gold threads. Chili oil carries heat through every corner. Even a teaspoon can transform a pot of rice or noodles into something powerful, salty, almost volcanic. Its endurance is no accident. Every component was originally made to survive long seasons without refrigeration. Modern families keep it for a different reason: convenience, depth, and a punch of flavor that never fades. When you look at these jars and tins lined up together, you start to see more than ingredients. You see strategy, endurance, quiet wisdom passed down through storms, shortages, and shifting seasons. And if these foods can last decades, imagine the deeper methods behind them. Next, we'll uncover how the Chinese store food for 20 years without refrigeration.